Murder at the Autumn Pumpkin Show. A Miss Marple mystery. The village of Little Densworth had long prided itself on two things: its tidy hedgerows and its annual autumn pumpkin show. Both were, in their own way, symbols of well-ordered rural life, neatly trimmed, fiercely competitive, and suspiciously quiet beneath the surface. On the last Saturday of October, the meadows around the village green were dotted with canvas booths, Bunting in shades of russet and gold, and an air of festive rivalry. Housewives compared chutneys, schoolchildren paraded scarecrows, and the vicar's wife, Mrs. Lilling, presided over the cake competition with an eye as sharp as a hawk's. Miss Jane Marple arrived in her customary neat hat and dove-grey coat, stepping from the bus with her Gladstone bag and the serene expression of one who has seen much and expects, quietly, to see more. She had been invited by her old friend, Mrs. Dolly Bantry, whose cousin, Colonel Miles, chaired the pumpkin show committee. "Jane, how wonderful you could come," cried Mrs. Bantry, bustling across the green. "We've the most frightfully grand event this year. There's even a fellow from the Home Office judging produce." Miss Marple smiled and allowed herself to be led toward a large white marquee adorned with garlands of orange dahlias. "It all looks very fine," she said. "Such splendid pumpkins. There's a comfort in these yearly rituals. So many things change, but country produce remains reassuringly solid." If only she had known how wrong she was. The setting and the cast. Little Densworth gathered that day its most notable inhabitants. Among them, Colonel Arthur Miles, a retired military man with an air of command and a moustache that bristled at insolence. Chair of the show committee, he was known to enforce rules with battlefield precision. Mrs. Prudence Miles, his much younger second wife, renowned for her charm and her collection of shawls. She was as admired as she was whispered about. Reverend Lionel Lilling, the earnest vicar, whose sermons on moral propriety were just as long as his cricket anecdotes. Mrs. Gracie Lilling, his industrious wife, who managed the church funds, the Fayette stall, and her husband with equal rigor. Mr. Roger Penfold, the local solicitor, smooth of manner and shrewd of eye, who had recently returned from London under a cloud of vague financial difficulties. Nora Blake, the bright, spirited young secretary of the show committee, efficient and markedly more intelligent than her employers realized. Tom Weaver, a gruff gardener employed at the Miles estate, with a reputation for knowing too much about everyone else's business. Miss Marple's sharp eyes rarely missed a telling glance or a nervous hand. As she moved through the crowd, she observed the little dramas of provincial life unfold. Mrs. Lilling's watchful glare at Mrs. Miles's décolletage, Colonel Miles's impatient snapping at Tom Weaver to mind the exhibits, Nora Blake's uneasy smile when Roger Penfold appeared beside her with a cigarette and a murmured word of flattery. "They do so love their competitions," said Mrs. Bantry, following Miss Marple's gaze. "You'd think a pumpkin was a matter of life and death." "Sometimes, dear Dolly," Miss Marple replied softly, "it very nearly is." The death. The pumpkin show reached its cheerful peak around 3 o'clock, when Colonel Miles announced the prizes from the wooden podium before the cheering crowd. The air smelled of hay, pastry, and pride. Miss Marple sipped warm tea and applauded as a vast orange specimen, the size of a small carriage wheel, was wheeled into the marquee. "A triumph of agricultural perseverance," boomed the colonel. "The first prize for best pumpkin goes to Mr. Tom Weaver." There was polite applause. Tom Weaver stepped forward, his ruddy face flushed, wiping his hands on his corduroy trousers. "Much obliged, sir," he said gruffly, "though I must say it were all the compost and no trickery." Colonel Miles laughed heartily. "A modest cultivator. Well done, Weaver, now." He stopped suddenly. His hand, resting on the prize plate, began to tremble. He looked down, his face whitening, eyes widening in surprise rather than pain. Then, without a sound, he collapsed forward onto the table, sending the silver trophies clattering to the ground. For a moment the crowd thought it a jest. Mrs. Bantry gasped. Miss Marple was already moving forward, her hands steady, her eyes calm and assessing. Colonel Miles lay utterly still. Dr. Redfern, the village physician, was sent for, but Miss Marple knew before he arrived. She had seen too many quiet deaths not to recognize one. "Poison, perhaps," she murmured under her breath, "though the manner is most peculiar. A man does not expire so suddenly without some assistance." When the doctor did arrive and confirmed there was nothing to be done, the cheerful hum of the fair turned into a subdued murmur of disbelief. The police was summoned from the nearby town of Market Chipping, and Inspector Grave, a tall, methodical man, soon took charge. "No sign of struggle," he said. "Likely heart failure, though we'll make certain. Dr. Redfern, you'll wish to examine him properly. Miss Marple, you know him well." "No, indeed," said Miss Marple mildly. "Only by reputation. But I did happen to think, just now, that he looked remarkably healthy for a supposed man with heart trouble." The inspector looked at her sharply, recognizing the keen intelligence behind those mild blue eyes. "You suspect foul play, ma'am." "I seldom suspect, Inspector," she said serenely. "I merely notice what is unlikely." The rumors begin. By evening, the village was alive with whispers. Some said Colonel Miles had been overexcited by the day's proceedings. Others hinted at something darker, that his wife, the glamorous Mrs. Prudence Miles, had tired of domestic life and found someone younger to admire her collection of shawls. Mrs. Bantry, pouring tea with unshaken hand, leaned toward Miss Marple. "They say she'll inherit a tidy sum. She was his sole beneficiary. But surely you don't think, oh, Jane, she couldn't have." Miss Marple took a delicate sip. "One must never rush to conclusions, dear, but certain minor details seem curious. For instance, that silver trophy the Colonel was holding, it had been polished rather excessively. I wonder by whom." "You mean poison might have been on the cup?" "Possibly, or in something else he touched shortly before his collapse. The tea stall, the cider barrels, there were so many opportunities. But poisoners, in my experience, are creatures of habit and precision." As the evening shadows lengthened across the green, Miss Marple made a quiet mental note of faces and gestures. Mrs. Miles's sorrow appeared dramatic, yet oddly rehearsed. Nora Blake's expression was pale and frightened. Tom Weaver had slipped away before anyone could question him, and Mr. Roger Penfold, that smooth solicitor, was seen speaking urgently with the vicar just before dusk. "A village tragedy," sighed Mrs. Bantry. "Yes," said Miss Marple softly, "and I'm afraid not an accident at all." The invitation. Later that evening, Miss Marple accepted the inspector's invitation to dine with him and discuss the event. He respected her opinion, though he would never admit how often it guided his own. "It's likely a heart seizure," said Inspector Grave, prodding his pudding thoughtfully. "Doctors sending him to the coroner in the morning, but if it were poison, how could anyone have done it in such a crowd?" "There are ways," Miss Marple mused. "It depends, of course, on what one wished to appear, an accident, a sudden heart attack, or perhaps a warning to someone else." She paused. The Colonel's expression just before he fell, it was not that of a man in pain, but of surprise, as though he had recognized something or someone. The inspector frowned. "You think he saw who did it?" "I think he knew why, Inspector, which, for the rest of us, is a rather important starting point." Outside, the wind rustled through the remaining banners of the pumpkin show. Somewhere, beyond the hedgerows, a lone owl called over the fields. Miss Marple looked thoughtfully into the dark, her knitting bag by her side. "Evil," she said quietly, "has a decidedly human face. It would be instructive, I think, to find out whose it was this time." "Such a dreadful affair," murmured Mrs. Bantry the following morning, stirring her porridge though she barely tasted it. "The Colonel gone, Prudence in tears, the whole village upended. It feels quite unnatural, Jane." Miss Marple looked out through the lace curtains of her friend's breakfast room, where the mist hung low over the lawns. "Evil," she said gently, "is nearly always unnatural, Dolly. That's why it stands out to those willing to notice." Inspector Grave had asked her to accompany him to the Miles residence later that morning. "You see things differently, Miss Marple," he'd said. "Half the village tells me the Colonel was poisoned, the other half blames Providence. I'd appreciate a steady eye." The Colonel's home, Heatherstone Lodge, was an early Edwardian house of solid proportions and modest grandeur. Its hall still smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and beeswax polish. The Colonel's umbrella hung just where he had left it. Prudence Miles, pale but carefully composed, received them in the drawing-room. "I can hardly take it in," she said, her voice quivering prettily. "Arthur fared so well only yesterday morning, so robust, so full of plans for next year's show." Inspector Grave inclined his head. "Had the Colonel any known illness, ma'am?" "None. He was always boasting of his constitution, ate like a navvy and walked the dogs for miles." "Oh, Inspector, it was the shock, the excitement, perhaps." Miss Marple's eyes drifted across the sideboard, untouched breakfast plate, 2 cups, one with a faint smear of lipstick. A faint chemical tang hung in the air. She noted it but said nothing. When the inspector asked about the upcoming inheritance, Prudence's composure flickered just slightly. Yes, I suppose everything passes to me, but what does money matter when one's heart is broken?" Miss Marple murmured something gentle. As they left, she asked the inspector quietly, "That odor, did you notice?" He nodded. "Peculiar stuff Dr. Redfern used to clean his instruments, perhaps." "Perhaps," said Miss Marple. "Yet it reminded me more of the disinfectant my cousin used to conceal the scent of cyanide in her greenhouse, rather unsuccessfully." Across the lane, the Reverend and Mrs. Lilling were receiving parishioners. The vicar wrung his hands. "A terrible blow to our community. Arthur was a pillar of decency." "Quite so," said Miss Marple, "though not, perhaps, universally loved." That produced a rather nervous laugh from Mrs. Lilling. "You do have a way of putting things, Miss Marple. There were quarrels now and then, show funds, volunteers, the usual petty matters." "Petty quarrels have a most inconvenient habit of becoming deadly," said Miss Marple mildly. "Who quarrelled most recently?" The vicar hesitated. "Roger Penfold, the solicitor fellow. Arthur accused him of mishandling some donation accounts for the Fayette. Penfold denied everything, of course, but tempers flared." "And Miss Blake?" "Nora, oh, she's such a good girl, frightfully loyal, though she was present when the argument occurred." By mid-afternoon, Miss Marple and the inspector were at the solicitor's office, a neat building on the high street. Roger Penfold greeted them smoothly, though his waxy complexion spoke of sleeplessness. "A shocking tragedy, Inspector, shocking," he said. "Poor old Miles. I was with him not 2 days ago discussing committee finances. We had our differences, but I respected him." "Differences?" "Purely official," said Penfold hastily. "He imagined funds misplaced, a simple bookkeeping delay." Miss Marple said nothing, merely watching as he fiddled with his cufflinks, gold, new and engraved. "Did you attend the show yesterday, Mr. Penfold?" "Indeed, I left early, though, around 1 o'clock." "Before the judging, then?" He nodded a shade too quickly. "Yes, my mother was well, had to attend to her." Outside, Inspector Grave exhaled. "He's hiding something." "Undoubtedly," said Miss Marple, "though not necessarily murder. Fear, financial embarrassment, or infatuation, any of these might produce similar symptoms." The next call was at the village hall, where the winning pumpkins still stood, forlorn under their bunting. Nora Blake was there, sorting papers into neat stacks. She started when she saw them. "I was just putting the ribbons away, Miss Marple. Everything feels so wrong, doesn't it?" "My dear," said Miss Marple kindly, "I always find that tidying things up rather helps when life becomes untidy." The girl gave a faint smile. "I can't believe Colonel Miles is gone. He was, well, strict but fair." "Did you serve him tea yesterday?" She blinked. "Yes, he wanted a cup before the judging. I made it myself from the urn." The inspector leaned forward. "Did anyone else have a cup from that pot?" "Oh yes, Mrs. Miles did, and Mr. Penfold too earlier. I made several that hour." Miss Marple's expression softened. "Did he add any sugar?" "Yes, he did. The Colonel said he needed the energy. I fetched the bowl from the committee table." "Who handled it before you?" Nora frowned. Tom Weaver had been helping shift things about. he might have touched it. That evening, Miss Marple walked home along the damp lane, turning over the puzzle in her mind. Poison seemed likely, but when, where, and how? She paused by the village pump, where Tom Weaver was refilling a bucket. He glanced up guiltily. "Even in, ma'ams." "A sad business, Mr. Weaver," said Miss Marple. "You knew the Colonel well, I think." Tom grimaced. "Well enough, hard man, never gave credit where due." "You must be pleased, then, that your pumpkin won first prize." He gave a grudging shrug. "Aye, though I'd rather no one had died over it." She studied his weathered face. "You helped at the tea table, didn't you?" "Only a minute, shifted a box. Then Mrs. Miles called me to carry her shawl, always summoning folk about that one." Later, safely by her lamp, Miss Marple set out her notes. "Colonel Miles, sudden death, symptoms consistent with poison. Possible delivery, tea or cup. Suspects Mrs. Miles, beneficiary, Roger Penfold, financial motive, Nora Blake, opportunity under pressure, Tom Weaver, resentment, Mrs. Lilling, gossip, motive possible. Question, what did the Colonel notice just before he fell?" She paused, needles clicking softly as she knitted. A recollection stirred, how the Colonel's hand had trembled upon the prize cup before he collapsed. Too neat, too theatrical. "Someone," she whispered, "wanted it seen as a heart failure and planted the proof in his hand." The next morning's inquest confirmed her suspicion, a trace of arsenic found in his system. The coroner ruled death by poisoning, source unknown. The village buzzed again, but now fear replaced curiosity. Inspector Grave met her in the lane. "It's poison right enough, and someone slipped it to him between the speeches and the judging, but blast it, everyone was there." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Everyone, yes, yet only one person had both occasion and foresight. We must think, Inspector, not of who could, but of who would, and that requires a close study of human nature." He sighed, "Meaning you've an idea already." "Not an idea," she said, "only a feeling, much like when one senses a pie crust's been tampered with before it browns." That evening she called upon Mrs. Miles unannounced. The young widow wore black silk and looked more magnificent than ever, a picture of poised despair. "My dear Prudence," said Miss Marple kindly, "I brought some tea, so hard for a lady alone." Mrs. Miles's hands fluttered. "You are very thoughtful. The neighbors have been kind, except that odious Mr. Penfold, who asked about Arthur's will this morning. Imagine such tastelessness." "Perhaps mere efficiency," said Miss Marple, "yet you seem surprisingly calm for one so newly bereaved." Mrs. Miles's eyes flashed. "What should I do? Scream? I prefer dignity." Miss Marple set down her basket. "Of course, though I did wonder about that delightful shawl you wore yesterday, the one with the golden fringe. Did it not smell faintly of almonds afterward?" The young woman stiffened. "Almonds, how ridiculous." "I dare say," murmured Miss Marple, "that I am often ridiculous. Good evening, my dear." Outside, the air was crisp and still. She smiled faintly into the night. There were cracks forming, hairline ones, but visible if one looked with care. "Now then," she said softly, "let us see whose mask falls first." 2 days after the inquest, the village was restless. The fairground, still half standing on the green, looked ghostly beneath the drizzle. Miss Marple moved quietly from shop to shop, noting faces, tones, fragments of gossip that fluttered like autumn leaves. Mrs. Lilling declaring that Mrs. Miles must be innocent because she cried in church. Old Mr. Peebles at the post office declaring all women cry when guilty. Inspector Grave sent word to Miss Marple that he'd found nothing tangible. "No prints, no unlabeled jars," he said grimly as they walked the muddy edge of the field. "The tea-urn, cups, sugar all clean. The chemist found traces of arsenic on the Colonel's cup only." "And yet," said Miss Marple, "arsenic rarely travels alone. Someone carried it upon their person, most inconveniently, to a public fete." "Then who would be reckless enough?" asked Grave. "The one most certain none would suspect her," said Miss Marple absently. That evening she visited Nora Blake again. The girl sat by the window sorting committee receipts. You do keep those tidy, my dear, Miss Marple said gently. She looked up with tired eyes. It's the only thing I can do right now. The others, Mr. Penfold hardly speaks to me since the inquest. Mrs. Miles, well, she's lovely but terrifying. In what way terrifying? Just too calm. Yesterday she was already discussing selling the Colonel's hunter, said the stables would be wasted otherwise. Miss Marple's needles paused mid-lope. Indeed. I suppose she's trying to be practical, the girl added nervously. Miss Marple smiled kindly. Practicality often precedes the settlement of an estate. Next morning, Inspector Grave summoned her to the police cottage. New evidence, he said. Tom Weaver came forward with this. He handed her a small folded note. Inside, in a bold masculine hand, were the words, "Meet me behind the produce tent at 2:30, important, a.m." Colonel's initials, said Grave. Weaver swears he found it near the cider barrels. And to whom was it addressed? Not signed, maybe meant for Penfold or Mrs. Miles herself. Miss Marple tapped her finger against the paper. Or perhaps Nora Blake, whose duties kept her near the tents at that very hour. They questioned Nora quietly later that morning. The poor girl turned pale at the note. He did ask me to fetch him then, she whispered. He wanted to check the accounts again, said he'd found something irregular. What sort of irregular? Demanded the inspector. I don't know, he only said we must speak privately. Miss Marple watched her trembling hands. And yet he never came, she said softly. He went instead to make his grand announcement before the crowd, quite certain that whatever irregularity he'd found would soon be corrected. Nora looked miserable. You think he discovered something awful about the funds? Possibly, Miss Marple said, or someone feared he had. Late that day, a curious event took place. Roger Penfold was seen leaving Heatherstone Lodge by the side gate after dusk. Mrs. Lilling, who saw him, described how he moved swiftly, glancing about. Miss Marple paid him a call next morning. Delivering legal papers, were you? She asked sweetly as he opened the door. Penfold stiffened. Nothing improper, I assure you. I never suggested impropriety. Only, people often find themselves in difficult errands when estates change hands. He frowned deeply. Look here, Miss Marple, this gossiping will ruin lives. Mrs. Miles is grief-stricken, and I wish only to help her. Indeed, you've known her some time. Since before her marriage, he admitted grudgingly. We met in London. She preferred stability. Miles gave her that. She inclined her head. And perhaps you now believe yourself poised to provide consolation. He flushed. That's a cruel thing to say. Truth is rarely kind, said Miss Marple, but it is rather loyal to those who listen. After she left, she met Tom Weaver outside the greengrocer. He shuffled awkwardly. I shouldn't have kept that note quiet, ma'am. But I didn't fancy being mixed up. You're a wise man to speak now, Miss Marple said kindly. Tell me, on the day itself, did you handle the silver trophies after the Colonel? He nodded reluctantly. I helped wipe 'em down before he gave the speech. With what cloths? 1 the shawls from the committee table. Mrs. Miles lent it, said it'd make 'em shine for the photos. Miss Marple stopped dead. Her shawl, you said? Yes, silky thing with golden fringe. Reckon she didn't want it messed, but she'd no other rag handy. That evening rain fell heavily, and the small parlour of Mrs. Bantry's house glowed with lamplight. Miss Marple sat close by the fire. Such complex notions, Dolly, she said quietly. Our poor Colonel, a strong man, undone not by his enemies, but by his affections. Mrs. Bantry looked confused. Affections, you mean Prudence? Precisely, she is a woman accustomed to admiration. It wearies such persons when attention fades. I fancy she sought comfort closer to home, with one whose discretion she trusted. Penfold, gasped Mrs. Bantry. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Or so he believes, but if he was her lover, he was used only as her shield. She had means, powder for moth protection containing arsenic, and an opportunity in lending that shawl. All that remained was occasion and motive. The next morning, Inspector Grave burst in. "We've proof someone cleaned the trophies with a cloth laced with poison. Weaver's cloth tested positive." "So," said Miss Marple calmly, "our culprit took care to ensure that only the colonel handled the poisoned plate before the collapse. Ingenious, though not perfect. You see, her fatal flaw was sentiment. She insisted he present the prize himself, even though she might easily have delegated it." The inspector blinked. "Her." Miss Marple smiled mildly. "My dear inspector, you've already guessed, but let her play out the rest. Guilty consciences crave confession. We need merely give them stage enough." That evening, Heatherstone Lodge blazed with light. Mrs. Miles had gathered friends under pretext of thanking the village for kindness. Miss Marple, by quiet arrangement with the inspector, attended as honored guest. The air shimmered with tension. Raising her glass, Prudence said smoothly, "It comforts me to be surrounded by friends who cared for my dear husband." Miss Marple's voice floated gently across the room. "Indeed, my dear, and soon your burdens of sorrow will be lightened once the police announce the means of the crime." A stillness fell. Mrs. Miles's fingers gripped her glass. "Crime." "Yes, the coroner confirmed arsenic, and Inspector Grave has found the article by which it was administered, a piece of cloth from a silk shawl." The young widow went white. "You can't possibly know that." "No," Miss Marple smiled. "I observed, my dear, that your shawl yesterday bore faint stains precisely where the metal had touched it. You told me you lent it for polishing. Curious, since no lady lends pure silk for such a purpose unless she must hide something far less becoming." Prudence tried to speak, but no sound came. The inspector stepped forward, presenting the laboratory paper. "There's enough arsenic in those threads to kill a regiment," he said quietly. For one taut second, silence. Then the glass fell from her hand and shattered. "You meddling old creature," she cried. "Do you think I meant him to die before half the village? I only meant a little illness, humiliation." Miss Marple's face remained kind, almost sorrowful. "Evil never gauges its dosage quite so neatly, my dear." They led her away weeping, as the rain finally ceased outside. The following morning dawned bleak and grey, a thin frost silvering the hedgerows. Miss Marple sat at the window of Mrs. Bantry's parlour, her knitting untouched. "It is curious," she murmured, "how truth, once spoken aloud, never seems quite simple again." Inspector Grave arrived at 10, hat in hand, his expression weary. "We've kept Mrs. Miles in custody pending the magistrate, but she's refusing a statement. Penfold claims ignorance, says she deceived him entirely." "Quite possibly," said Miss Marple, "though I doubt he is altogether blameless. There are moral partnerships as damning as legal ones." He paced the rug. "The evidence seems tight enough. The poisoned shawl, her opportunity, her motive." Miss Marple looked out at the misted garden. "Tight enough for the law, yes. And yet, Inspector, I keep turning over one puzzle. Why would a clever woman such as she poison the very cup that her husband would hold in front of hundreds? Poison, you see, is private by nature. It craves solitude. To act publicly is to risk discovery before intention is fulfilled." Grave frowned. "You think we've missed something?" "I think," said Miss Marple mildly, "we have been given exactly what someone wished us to see." By lunchtime, she stood again at the gates of Heatherstone Lodge, its grand front door shut tight and gloomy. Nora Blake met her there, anxious and hollow-eyed. "Inspector said I could pack Mrs. Miles's things," she stammered. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's horrible. I can't believe she'd do it." "Perhaps she didn't," said Miss Marple softly. "Tell me, my dear, who insisted that cleaning cloth be used on the trophies?" "Why, Mr. Penfold suggested it," Nora said after a pause. "He said the light would show smudges in the photographs, and Mrs. Miles fetched her shawl when he asked." Miss Marple's eyes brightened faintly. How very practical of him. To test her suspicion, Miss Marple walked to the solicitor's office. Penfold looked tired but defiant. "If you've come to accuse me again, madam, you're wasting your breath," he snapped. "Quite the opposite," said Miss Marple gently. "I came to assure you that blame seldom rests on one alone." He gave a harsh laugh. "Is that comfort? Prudence betrayed me. I loved her and she used me. The letters I wrote her, they'll ruin me." "Letters, indeed," said Miss Marple quietly. "Then it was you who feared discovery when the Colonel spoke of irregularities. It wasn't only financial mischief he meant, was it? He'd found your correspondence." Penfold turned pale. "You can't prove that." "I need not," said Miss Marple, "but she could, and likely threatened to if you didn't assist her. You see, Mr. Penfold, the poison shawl bore her scent, but the hand that prepared it was steady, too steady for panic. You are an efficient man, precise in every act." He said nothing. His jaw worked soundlessly. Miss Marple regarded him kindly. Men often imagine women compel them, yet more often they do what they secretly wish, if only they had nerve enough. "Did you imagine her free, then? Did you picture marrying her once the old Colonel gone?" Penfold suddenly slumped into his chair, face ashen. "She begged me only to frighten him. I mixed the powder in the cloth myself. It was supposed to make him ill, that's all. She swore arsenic in that quantity would do no worse." Miss Marple sighed. "Arsenic is a most deceptive substance, Mr. Penfold. It kills quicker in vanity than in dosage." When Grave arrived minutes later, the solicitor was ready to confess everything. How Prudence Miles had wept over her jealous husband, how she'd hinted at bruises of the spirit and begged Penfold for protection, how they'd planned a harmless lesson in humility. The powder came from a sample case at Penfold's cousin's apothecary shop. He had soaked a silk cloth in a diluted solution the day before the fete. The Colonel's unexpected perspiration and the heat of the tent caused the poison to absorb through his skin faster than intended. Miss Marple listened quietly as the confession spilled forth. When they left the office, Grave said gruffly, "You knew from the start it wasn't just her." "One comes to recognize accomplices, Inspector. They hide behind gallantry or pity. Mrs. Miles tempted him, but he needed little persuasion to act foolishly." That evening, Prudence Miles faced her former lover across the police station cell. She wept uncontrollably when told he had confessed. "I never meant him to die so soon," she whispered. "I only wanted freedom." Miss Marple watched her silently from the corridor. When Grave joined her, she said, "Pride and self-pity, Inspector, a more potent poison than arsenic, I think." 2 days later, the newspapers proclaimed the case closed. Both were to stand trial at the assizes for manslaughter. Little Densworth sighed as though released from a long-held breath. The bunting came down. Autumn settled into its neutral silence. At Mrs. Bantry's tea table, conversation returned to weather and knitting patterns. "I don't know how you do it, Jane," she said, buttering a scone, "always finding the truth in such muddle." Miss Marple smiled over her cup. "It isn't cleverness, dear, only observation. I once had a young gardener who blamed the maid for his broken teapot when in fact it was the cat. The same principle applies, you know. People will always point the finger toward whoever seems simplest to blame." She looked toward the window, where faint sunlight spilled across the garden. "A pity about those pumpkins, though. Such lovely specimens, quite wasted." Mrs. Bantry chuckled weakly. "You are hopeless, Jane." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Not hopeless, dear, only realistic. Evil may be as perennial as weeds, but so is good, and both must be tended if one wishes the garden to endure." Outside, church bells began to chime, soft and distant, mingling with the smell of damp earth and wood smoke. Miss Marple folded her knitting neatly, rose with quiet grace, and said, "Well, that's another pumpkin season behind us. I dare say next year's crop will grow uncommonly fine." She reached for her hat, the faintest smile touching her lips, and stepped into the brisk autumn air. Winter came early to Little Densworth that year. Frost lay heavy on the garden walls, and the last of the pumpkins, forgotten in a corner field, turned pale beneath the chill sky. Inside the vicarage hall, townsfolk gathered once more, this time not for celebration, but for solace. The case of Colonel Miles had ended in the High Court just a week earlier. Mrs. Prudence Miles was sentenced to 15 years, Roger Penfold to 10. Few spoke their names aloud now, as if punishment itself could erase the discomfort of guilt shared by an entire village. Miss Marple, visiting the Bantrys for Christmas, leaned close to the hearth with her knitting, listening to the wind press against the windows. Mrs. Bantry sighed. I can't take joy in it, Jane. None of us can, to think. Such an awful scheme, born in our tidy little show. Evil has no taste, dear, said Miss Marple softly. It slips in where there's opportunity, be it London or Little Densworth. A letter lay on the table, one from Nora Blake. Since the trial, she had gone to her aunt's in Bath. Miss Marple lifted the envelope. She says she's found a secretarial post and feels ever so much stronger for leaving. She writes kindly of the Colonel's dogs. She's arranged new homes for them all. Mrs. Bantry nodded. A brave girl, and Tom Weaver, he's joined a nursery garden in Devon, I hear. Yes, life buds again, Dolly, once the frost has done its work. That evening Miss Marple walked alone through the quiet lane toward the green. Snow powdered the hedges. The fairground field, empty now, seemed large and solemn, the place where laughter had turned once to silence. She paused by the gate, thinking of the Colonel's last startled look, of the shawl's shimmer in the sun, of a woman's trembling hand and a man's folly dressed as devotion. Inspector Grave approached out of the grey mist, stamping his boots. I rather thought I'd find you here, Miss Marple. She smiled faintly. Old habits, Inspector, gardens of memory do need pruning. He nodded uneasily. Reports came today. Both prisoners have admitted the whole scheme in writing. Seems she planned to plead her way through sorrow, but the jury saw through it. Still, the village owes you something fierce. Oh, not at all, she said. Truth reveals itself, Inspector. One only needs patience and an understanding that sin, like mildew, thrives where envy is left untended. They stood in silence a while, watching the weak sun fade. Then Grave said, Funny thing, you'd think such wickedness would ruin a place, yet come spring, they'll hold another show. They will, said Miss Marple, because goodness insists on carrying on. We plant again, we bake again, we trust again. That is the truest form of courage. When she turned back toward the Bantry house, the chimneys already smoked with evening tea. Inside, Mrs. Bantry fussed cheerfully, determined that plum pudding could banish every sadness. Do sit down, Jane. We've hot mince pies and a fire big enough for 3. Miss Marple smiled, settling by the warmth. The perfect setting, Dolly, rest, light, and a little wisdom to season it all. She poured out tea with her usual graceful precision. It's interesting, really, she mused. The Colonel lived by order and rules, his wife by charm and deceit, and both forgot that affection, plain and honest, is rarer than any prize pumpkin. Pride made one careless, vanity made the other cruel, and fire and frost seldom meet without cracking the ground between them. Mrs. Bantry clasped her hands. And what about you, Jane, never tired of untangling these dreadful things? Miss Marple chuckled softly. My dear, knitting and murder have much in common. Both require patience, a steady eye, and the ability to see a pattern before the rest of the world does. It rather keeps one occupied. The clock struck 9. Outside, snowflakes drifted thickly past the window, gentle and unthreatening. Miss Marple leaned back, her needles glinting in the firelight, content that the village would sleep peacefully once more. In her heart, she felt neither triumph nor sorrow, only recognition that human frailty would always find expression somewhere, and that it was her peculiar blessing to notice it before it grew too wild. When she finally rose to go, she wrapped her shawl snugly about her shoulders. A fine evening to walk, she said. The stars do their part, you know. They remind one that even the darkest stories end beneath a bit of light. And with that, Miss Jane Marple stepped into the snow-covered lane, her silhouette small but certain against the quiet, eternal calm of the English countryside.